Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into the fascinating cosmological history laid out in the Golden Laws. Specifically, we're zeroing in on Chapter 5, a period the text beautifully calls a time when love overwhelms the earth. Whether you've read this cover to cover or you're just jumping in, we're going to unpack the author's totally unique spiritual timeline. Because in this framework, human history isn't just some random series of events. Oh no, it's a highly orchestrated plan guided by high-dimensional spirits.
And the text sets up this wild framework right from the jump. It claims that human history is actually guided by a succession of reincarnated, high-dimensional spirits whose whole purpose is bringing light and love to Earth. The core message? It's a huge call to move past our national borders and realize we share this massive spiritual lineage. It sets up the premise that legendary historical figures weren't just isolated leaders or made-up myths, but literally connected comrades of light, teaming up to build a global utopia. How cool is that?
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, the Cantare worldview. Then, Zeus and the Greek era. Next, Apollo's quest for light, followed by Moses in the Exodus. Then we hit Elijah and Jesus. And finally, Muhammad's Islamic revelations. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The Cantare worldview.
Okay, take a look at this timeline. It maps out these massive eras, from ancient Greece all the way down to the rise of Islam. What the text is doing here is linking these giant cultural and religious milestones into what's basically one continuous cosmic relay race. And according to the book, this entire race is guided by a supreme spiritual consciousness known as El Cantare.
Moving to Section 2. Zeus, the Greek era.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. According to the source material, Zeus wasn't just some mythological sky god throwing lightning bolts. The text says he was a real historical figure, specifically a ninth-dimensional spirit who incarnated on the island of Crete way back in the 17th century BC. The narrative says he lived a totally human life, married Hera, who, by the way, is described as having incredible prophetic abilities, and even gained his own spiritual awakening at age 27 with the help of the spirit of Hermes. I mean, it's a complete reinterpretation of classical antiquity, right?
Section 3. Apollo's quest for light.
So the text draws a super sharp contrast here between father and son. While Zeus's mission was all about outward action, state building, military leadership, and fiercely battling opposing forces like Poseidon in his era, Apollo's mission was totally internal. Apollo, the Shining One, is depicted as a youth who was all about art, literature, music, and deep meditative reflection. It's a very deliberate balancing act in this spiritual history. First, you have the warrior king, and then the philosopher-artist.
And that leads us to a really pivotal moment in the narrative. Picture this. Apollo is meditating under the stars on Mount Olympus, and he receives a direct spiritual revelation. The spirit of the deceased Zeus actually appears to him. Zeus warns him that their royal house will eventually fall, but he urges Apollo to keep guiding humanity just through teachings of the mind and heart instead. The text asserts that this is exactly how the baton of spiritual leadership gets passed down.
But this brings up a pretty fascinating question. How on earth does the author bridge the gap between this classical Greek era and the Abrahamic faiths that would eventually spread across the globe? Let's take a look.
Section 4. Moses and the Exodus. All right, so jumping to Moses. The crucial point here is how the text categorizes the Ten Commandments into distinct religious, moral, and ethical laws, all designed to build a divine social order for the Israelites. But here is the wild cosmological twist the book throws at us. It identifies the voice from the burning bush, Yahweh, as a ninth-dimensional spirit named Enlil. So Moses' mission was essentially to synthesize these divine laws into a practical, working framework so he could guide a massive population out of Egypt.
Which brings us to Section 5, Elijah and Jesus. The author outlines the prophet Elijah's role in the 9th century BC, portraying him as a staunch, totally unyielding defender of monotheism. Elijah, the fighter, is presented here as a real spiritual warrior. He famously battled hundreds of prophets of the deity Baal on Mount Carmel, fiercely protecting Yahweh's teachings so they wouldn't get diluted by polytheism. Then we hit the 1st century AD with Jesus Christ, the Savior. The text asserts that during his lost years, Jesus spent time meditating in the caves of Qumran, near the Dead Sea. But get this, he wasn't just praying, he was acting as a high-level spiritual scholar. According to the author, Jesus masterfully integrated global philosophies. He took the concept of karma from Buddhism, spiritual disciplines like exorcism from yoga, and the battle between good and evil from Zoroastrianism. And then, he bound all of those diverse ideas together with his ultimate teaching of love. This literally launched the era of love overwhelming the world.
Section 6. Muhammad's Islamic Revelations. The text then impartially details Muhammad's revelations, which, much like the prophets before him, were given to him in a cave. These revelations culminated in the 6 articles of faith. The author explains that this highly structured, clear theology wasn't just random. It was a massive, necessary spiritual innovation. The goal was to unify the deeply divided, polytheistic tribal societies of the Arabian Peninsula at that time.
However, the author makes a point to specifically contrast the environments of Jesus and Muhammad. Jesus' path was rooted in deep ascetic meditation, which kept his teachings purely spiritual. Muhammad, on the flip side, had to navigate a bustling, intense commercial society. He was forced by his circumstances to take on real military and political leadership. The text suggests that because Muhammad's mission required this heavy focus on political and physical survival, rather than just monastic asceticism, it fundamentally laid the groundwork for how the religion structured itself. And the author uses this context to explain some of the historical conflicts that followed. So, bringing all of this together, the source material presents this grand, unifying theory. It essentially views Earth as a giant cosmic school or training ground. Souls from different stars, different dimensions, and totally different cultural backgrounds continuously incarnate here to rub shoulders, experience friction, and ultimately learn from one another. By repeatedly being born into different faiths, maybe you're a Christian in one life, a Buddhist in another, these spirits slowly build a shared, unified human character over millions of years. The text even traces this right into the modern era, pointing to Kanza Uchimura's faith and Masaharu Taniguchi's philosophy of the true nature of life as modern continuations of this exact same cosmic effort to teach love.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. If we are all continuously reincarnating and learning from figures like Zeus, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and modern philosophers, how will these incredibly diverse global faiths eventually converge into a single truth? It's a concept that absolutely challenges us to see our neighbors not as strangers, but as fellow students in this massive cosmic school. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.